Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Dhobhany, Public Programs Assistant Producer here at the Shed, and I want to welcome you all to Invention, Experimentation, and Radical Imagination, our fifth encounter as part of our ongoing conversation series, Matters for Conversation and Action, taking place in conjunction with the exhibition Particular Matters by artist Tomás Saraceno, on view at the Shed through April 17. As always, we want to start by sharing the points of access that are available today. Live closed captioning is provided by Missy Smith. To turn it on, please click the CC button in the bottom right of your Zoom window. We also have American Sign Language interpretation provided by Rory Burton and Lavender DeJulia, who should be visible at all times. Please feel free to connect with our team with any comments or questions regarding your participation through the chat feature on the right of the screen. For any questions you'd like to ask our speakers during the discussion, please use the Q&A button that's also at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will have a dedicated section towards the end of the conversation to answer as many of them as we can. As you may know, Tomás Saraceno is an artist whose practice lives very much at the intersection of art and science, and very much in the realm of collaborative research, production, and advocacy. It is in that spirit that we want to dive deeper into the possible commonalities, from areas of interest and approach to process, synergies, as well as the possibilities or potentialities between arts and science. It is also in that spirit that our collaboration with the Columbia Climate School and the Studio Saraceno took place, producing this series of 6 conversations that are soon coming to an end. We couldn't be more grateful to our outstanding set of speakers for joining us today. Caroline Jones, professor in the History, Theory, and Criticism section of the Department of Architecture, and also serving as an Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Kate Marvel, research scientist at the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University. Molly Nesbit, professor of art at Vassar College. And moderating today, Sandra Goldmark, Associate Professor of Professional Practice in Theater and Director of Campus Sustainability and Climate Action at Barnard College of Columbia University. Before having them join, I want to thank our partners again, Columbia Climate School and Studio Saraceno, for their ongoing co-conspiration in putting together this series. I also want to thank the Ford Foundation for supporting and making this series possible. I invite you all to check out our website, theshed.org, for recordings of past conversations and information on our next and final session around rights of nature with some exceptional international guests. And now I want to introduce our wonderful colleague, Alix Schroder from Columbia's Climate School. And then I'll ask Alix that you pass it on to Caroline, Kate, Molly, and Sandra. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Alix Schroder. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Initiatives at the Columbia Climate School. I've had the great pleasure to work with Sarah and the SHED team to shape this public programming series, which connects to and builds on the incredible and thought-provoking art of Tomás Saraceno. Excuse me. So thank you to both the SHED and to Studio Saraceno for your inspiration and hard work on this exhibit and event series. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight on behalf of the Columbia Climate School. Our school aims to provide the scholarship needed to tackle the climate crisis and related problems, and also to provide potential solutions through interdisciplinary research, partnerships, education, innovative technologies, and the sharing of ideas. This public program series is a great example of the power of interdisciplinary collaborations and partnership. These discussions bring together diverse panelists to explore a range of critical topics connected to climate and environmental justice. Today's event in particular explores the intersections between art and science. Art and science share a common motivation and goal to understand and describe the world around us. Both worlds require a great deal of creativity, innovation, and dedication. Bringing these fields together through this series serves as a powerful way to inspire new ideas, build new bridges, and forge innovative pathways forward. So on that note, I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and I will hand it off to my colleague, Sandra Goldmark, who is moderating tonight's discussion.
Hi, everyone. Perhaps our panelists could also turn on their cameras. Thank you all to our audience who has come digitally to hear this conversation. I just want to say before we begin, there is a Q&A. You can add questions throughout the evening and we'll be looking at them and have some time hopefully at the end to discuss your questions. As Alix mentioned, my name is Sandra Goldmark. I teach at Barnard College and I work with the Columbia Climate School. I work on sustainability and climate issues, but I am originally a theatrical set designer. So coming as I do from a background in the arts, tonight's conversation is really exciting for me. I'm thrilled to be joined by these wonderful panelists, three brilliant panelists who very much work at the intersection of art and science and that increasingly, hopefully, blurred boundary. I just want to share that I'm particularly interested in tonight's conversation in the context of climate change and hope that we'll touch on questions of how these kinds of collaborations can serve a bigger picture climate response. In what ways does working across boundaries actually perhaps necessary given the ecological crisis that we face? But before we get into the big questions like that, I'd love to just ask each panelist to tell us a little bit. We've heard your official titles, but I'd love to just hear what you do in the world, what your work is, if you could share. To the one to the right of me is Kate, so I'll hand it off.
Right. Thank you so much for that great introduction. So hi, everybody. I'm Kate Marvel. My training is actually in physics. So I have a PhD in theoretical particle physics. Specifically, I was working in string cosmology, which is the study of the entire universe. And I realized pretty early on in my PhD that this is the only part of the universe that's any good. So I switched gears and now I study the Earth full time. Specifically, I'm a climate scientist. I'm interested in climate change, past, present, and future. What happened in the past, what's happening now, and what can we expect in the future. I also try to be a writer, and I try to do a lot of public communication, mostly because I think that what I work on is really important, but also because it's really interesting and it's really fun, and I want to share that with as many people as possible.
Thanks, Sandra. I like to say that I'm privileged to learn from students and artists. I'm an art historian and I'm a professor at MIT. So perforce, most of my students are not going to become art historians. Most of them are in the sciences or in technical fields. So I feel very lucky to be kind of in that slipstream of education where I learn from them and I hope they learn from me. And I guess, you know, I've been thinking with the work of Saraceno for a really long time. So that's one reason I'm here. And I also want to say that I'm incredibly interested in the topic that Kate raised about how we communicate more broadly about the feelings we might have about being in a planet that is a dynamic system. So I have a lot of optimism about art's capacity to do that. And I'll just put in a plug for an exhibition I'm helping to curate with my colleagues at the List Visual Art Center at the MIT campus called Symbionts: Contemporary Artists and the Biosphere. So I'm really super charged up about the capacity of artists to work with living materials to help us understand that we're completely entangled in life systems, not just consumers and extractors of those systems. So anyway, that's my spiel for the moment.
Thank you. I love that. Entangled, indeed. Molly?
Hi, everybody. I'm Molly Nesbit, and I, too, am an art historian. I teach at Vassar. And, you know, to be quick about it, because I'd really like to talk about Tomás's work more than my own. I study art as it spills into the world. And so I've worked on Marcel Duchamp, and I've done many projects and, you know, collaborations, essays, and so on with living artists, one of whom is Tomás. And the beauty of that is that my life of the mind actually is not bounded by the university or my scientific research. And so the way thinking spills into the world without losing its edge, let's say, really interests me. And so I'm pleased to be here tonight to share ideas with people I know, like Caroline already, but the others I've never met before. I think we'll have a good time. And so let the games begin.
I love that. Already so many threads, filaments, dare I say, pun intended, to pick up on. So which brings us in a sort of ham-fisted way to Saraceno's work, which I think is a great starting point, obviously, for this conversation. And I thought I would open the conversation by bringing to mind the titular piece, Particular Matters, which for me was one of the most, of many powerful moments in the exhibit, was one of the most powerful, where we're in a big dark room, and we see dust motes illuminated by a beam of light. And for me, I felt that in inviting me to look so closely at these tiny, often invisible specks, the piece opened up a view into perhaps, Kate, what you said you studied in the earlier part of your career, the whole universe, without having to learn string theory. But it's such a powerful moment, and it really made me think about these questions of scale, of connecting the dots between the very, very tiniest things and the biggest, vastest scale that we can imagine. And for me, it also connected to questions that I've been struggling with and thinking about with my students about scale, not just of art and objects in the universe, but also of our actions and how we connect facing this big global crisis, how we can connect the dots between small scale, where we live, what we see in front of us, and the big picture. So that's a big, broad opening, and I'd love for each of you to hear a little bit how you experience this question of scale in Saraceno's work, in this exhibit, or in other work. And maybe we'll start with Molly, reverse the order, if that's all right.
I'm happy. I think the question of scale is very important when you start looking at the way art presents itself and is presented in built space, because built space tends to organize the scale and organize us. And so in many ways, the work of art is staged, which gets us back to the theater. And when it is staged, often the scale of the experience remains consistent from room to room. What happens with Tomás's shows is that he's inconsistent, and you're often learning a lot, but you're also often destabilized because the point of view question is there. And when you put a point of view question on the table that baldly, it opens up the existential questions, which is where one goes with the questions of our climate.
And Caroline and Kate, we should all just jump in. Like I'll rein us in if we need to, but I don't want to like over moderate the situation. So let's just go for it when the spirit moves you.
Well, I think sometimes he invokes scale by telling us that the dust is not random. So I wanted to connect your experience in New York with, particulate matters to the exhibition. Sadly, I wasn't going to spend the carbon to go see, but in Buenos Aires, he staged an exhibition with the dust and brought it from Berlin because he specifically wanted cosmic dust. And Kate can tell us a little bit about where the heck that comes from, but apparently it rains down on us rather constantly. And you can go to the rooftops of Berlin, if it's an old enough building, and collect it and, look back into the history of the universe. I mean, it's quite amazing that we have these cosmic particles that rain down on us. So I just want, to show something of the scale and the cleverness of the artist. I realized, like, as an art historian, I don't even need slides because they're books. I don't know if the focus will hold.
A little closer, I think.
Okay, and we've also got shiny paper. But he's got speakers amplifying spider vibrations, which is also there in the Enlightenment giant dome that we inhabit with Free the Air, which we can also talk about, just sheer massive size that makes us very small scale in that environment. So the speakers in Buenos Aires were vibrating and agitating cosmic dust. So it was an effort to discursively and kind of, conceptually connect the web of the spider to the cosmic web at the beginning of the universe. So he's very conscious of these things. Whether he can pull them off from the criterion of a string theorist and climate scientist is really, I'd love to hear Kate comment about that. But it's extremely poetic to be in a room where you're realizing that you're smelling in the cosmic dust, and Carl Sagan was the famous popularizer who said, you're made of stardust, right? And that becomes a Crosby, song. Anyway, the point is there's a popular cultural understanding, I hope, of the fact that we are stardust, that we cannot exist without these minerals and processes from a very distant past in the universe that gave us a planet to live on, right? So Tomás is fully fascinated by that, fully interested in that. And he uses his architectural training, I think, to bring those questions of, powers of 10 in the famous film by the Eames collaboration to say, we're in that scale, but that doesn't mean we can't think of other scales. And the disorientation that Molly mentioned is extremely important. So, we are destabilized. We are thrown off our comfort zone. And that's very important to considering these cosmic scales.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on that theme of destabilization and feeling disoriented and the fundamental inconsistency of scales. Because as a physicist, I kind of know that when you look really closely at physics, it turns into magic. Because, an equation like F equals ma, that's literally a way to predict the future. And if you know the exact initial conditions, you will be able to, and exactly the forces acting on an object, for example, you will be able to say something about what it's doing for all time. So I really do feel like physics is the closest that we can get to magic. And
can you translate, is that force equals mass, force equals mass
times acceleration, Newton's second law. Yeah.
Or well done,
any, in any form of that law, any physical equation that basically says that if we know enough, we can know the state of a system for all time. And that's really, really powerful. But obviously, a climate model is not perfectly predictive. Climate models have inconsistencies. Climate models have uncertainties. We don't know everything about the Earth. And one of the reasons that we don't know everything is this idea of scale, is the idea of inconsistencies. So for example, we know exactly how clouds form. We understand cloud formation. It's a process that happens on really small scales when little ice crystals or water droplets coagulate around dust grains. So we understand clouds. And we know a lot about how the entire planet works. We know how currents of air move around at large scales. But when you try to put together something that's happening at a really small scale and something that happens at really, really large scales, that's really difficult. You have to make choices. You cannot include in a climate model of the entire Earth every single dust grain, every single water droplet in the entire atmosphere. So you have to make approximations. You have to find ways to represent those things going on at small scales, at very, very large scales. And that's where uncertainties come in. That fact that you are trying to understand physics at multiple scales leads to questions. It leads to things that we don't know. And so that's why that idea of destabilization and inconsistency really resonated with me as a physicist.
What about your experience of the show or the work, your own physical experience of it? Does it affect the way you think about this at all, or
Was that a question for me, or?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Yeah, I think, the feeling of disorientation, the feeling of destabilization and weirdness is something that I think is going to be familiar to any scientist, because if you don't feel that discomfort, if you don't feel that I'm entering into a world that doesn't make any sense, then you're not doing science well enough. You're just reiterating things that other people have done. And I imagine, I'd love to hear your perspective. I imagine it's the same for artists. I imagine if you are always feeling safe, if you are never feeling queasy, if you are never feeling like you're maybe making a mistake, you're probably not doing very effective art.
No, it's the same. I think.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. When I had the privilege of being on that web inside, Free the Air, I was struck through the whole process of the vibrations that I was being put on a stage as potential prey. Now, it's, full disclosure, I grew up watching Sunrise Theater in North Carolina, which was a 6 a.m. horror movie that always featured giant spiders. Inevitably, giant spiders coming out of radioactive caves, right? But I think Tomás wants to put your body there and get you to think about, what if we weren't apex predators? What if we were, in fact, negotiating with the spider, right? And I think the theorist Val Plumwood has talked about this so beautifully. We are prey, we are prey, we are meat, we are food, but we are more than food. Crocodile is predator, but also more than predator, right? So I think that's also a very surprising effect of this cosmic dome, which goes back, Molly's probably more of an expert, but it goes back to the cenotaph for Newton that was never built. Saraceno is going to be the one to build it in New York in a giant light-filled dome, which is also a perceptual experiment in the Gansfeld, and he's going to make us prey. He's going to make us quaking with the spider communications. And
wait a minute, Caroline, aren't we going to float? Isn't it going to be airborne?
Oh, that I don't know. That's great. Somebody told me about that.
So one of you want to explain this for the audience? What are you talking about? What's going to happen?
Maybe Sarah can give us an image of that extraordinary installation, which I imagine some percentage of the audience tonight has been in it. And Sarah also has queued up a precursor work in my mind as an art historian, which was the space-time foam. Okay, I had to write the name down because,
Space-time foam.
So Sarah, do you have that image?
Right, space-time foam in Milan at the Hangar Bicocca, a giant useless volume of space in a post-industrial world that was used as another one of these highly disoriented environments.
So the image is not up yet. There we go.
There we go. Yeah.
So do you want to tell us what we're looking at here?
Well, I didn't experience it. Maybe Molly did. I don't know.
I did. I could talk a little bit about it.
Take it away, Molly.
So the space is square, and you get a sense of how big it is. It's a tower at the Hangar Bicocca, and which is a decommissioned factory space, and there are three levels of heavy plastic stretched across, like each one making, let's say, a floor, one above the other. And there's compressed air pumped in between the layers. And you, the public, queued up for quite a while. This was really popular in Milan, especially with the kids. And you could, in small groups, just like at the shed, go out into the level on the plastic. And with the other people, the way the weighting worked is if everybody stood in one place, you'd be down at the bottom of a valley and you would not be able to get out. But for that purpose, they had some ski guides from the Italian Alps who would come pull you if you needed to be pulled to safety. But basically, everybody figured out that you've kept a little distance and you floated on this kind of pillowy surface,
which is
but
a
you had to
membrane,
crawl.
right? It's a
and
membrane.
so it threw you back to the point in your life when you crawled instead of walked. And there was something really profound about it, and quite beautiful. And then you could look up through the plastic and see other people crawling around too. And they, performed a kind of spider function, I guess. But it also felt very aquatic.
This is fascinating and gorgeous.
I think Tomás is on the chat, which is super exciting. But I remember him describing that the motion people had to do was a kind of swimming, right? It was a kind of frontal crawling on these membranes, right? So that's a very good analogy. I don't know, Sarah, do you have anything queued up of the shed's current Free the Air? How to hear the universe in a spider web?
She said 1 minute.
1 minute, great.
So while Sarah's finding that, I wonder if I love ski guides. Talk about truly an interdisciplinary approach. We've got scientists, artists, and ski guides. It's close to my heart. But I want to talk a little bit about what that kind of interdisciplinarity brings to your work, either the work of an artist or Kate, the work of a scientist, or both. Does it begin to break down those boundaries or those traditional silos between the quote unquote official roles we have? And do we start to wind up with something new? How does it, what does working this way do for the work or for you as a creator? Maybe we'll hand that one to Kate. You can start us off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm staring at this plastic sheeting right now, and it's amazing. But it makes me think a lot about the way that you're taught relativity, general relativity, when you first encounter it. And basically, the theory of general relativity, which Einstein is very famous for, is that everything is lazy. Everything fundamentally just wants to move in a straight line. And the reason that things move along curved paths is because they are moving in a straight line along space-time, which has been deformed. So Einstein's theory of gravity is just, by virtue of having mass, everything, including you, deforms its surrounding space-time. And really, really large things, really, really massive things, like our sun, deform space-time enough so that the Earth, which is falling toward the sun, keeps falling and keeps missing. And that leads to an orbit around the sun. And the thing that I think is really interesting is that fundamentally, you can't visualize general relativity. You can't visualize four-dimensional space-time. You can write mathematical equations for it, and those equations start to make sense. But fundamentally, there is no easy way to translate between the math and any form of understanding that anybody has ever had. And to me, that is a place where art can be really, really helpful for scientists, knowing that there might be a space which we can just barely access, coming at that space by different ways, thinking about that space and using sort of different ways of knowing, can be really, really helpful. I think there's also, as a climate scientist, there's also a sort of more utilitarian merging of art and science that's really necessary, which is that, I care about the planet and I would like for everything not to die. And that means that it's really important to communicate the urgency of climate change and the reality of climate change and what it means. Scientists, we have been trying to do that for years and years and years. And even though, this is not because we're not charismatic, it's not because we're not thinking really hard about how to do it, it's because fundamentally, people don't respond to charts and graphs. People don't respond to equations. People respond to stories. People respond to messengers. People respond to concepts. And I'm getting really sick of seeing headlines that are like, scientists worried about this ice sheet in Antarctica. Because I always think, like, what what are the rest of you doing? Why aren't the rest of you worried? And I think, from that perspective, it is really crucial to have the support of artists in thinking about how to tell stories that are compelling and true about climate change.
Love that, the idea of one glimpsing things that, in a way, that's exactly what I felt looking at the dust motes. I felt like I could glimpse or understand something in a physical way or spiritual way. I'm not sure in what way it was, but it wasn't like, the way I might understand it through a different way of knowing. And then this question of communicating and moving people, which maybe those are one and the same. Maybe you have to know things on these multiple levels through these multiple ways of knowing in order to be moved to action or to really feel it.
Do you want more comment on the art science interdisciplinarity?
I do. I hope that the audience does.
Just if we're having that conversation. I think Tomás is justly proud of publishing a scientific paper on three-dimensional spider webs, which I think if anyone listening can reflect, you might realize that the canonical spider web is actually the two-dimensional kind. That is the iconography, that is the, most of the studies are on that kind of spider. They're called orb weavers, I believe. And Tomás became fascinated by these three-dimensional webs, which are on display as actual, fossil, as it were, abandoned webs at the shed. So he did kind of a very primitive scan of that was sort of genius, I think. He just passed a laser through very specific sections of that spider web that had been woven in a plexi box, and he took pictures of each slice that the laser made. And then he compiled those pictures in stacks and made a three-dimensional model, which it took computer scientists at MIT it took like a doctoral student most of his thesis work to actually make it manipulable. Actually make it kind of interactive, right? But just the brilliance of a very basic idea that you're just gonna, as Kate said, you're gonna make an approximation of how this web is all connected to itself by taking samples that are in a particular order that you're gonna make sense out of. Very scientific process, actually, and that was the area in which he published that paper. But I, for my part, also maintain that art does something that scientists are not often allowed to do. Scientists are usually required to, be very confident, to show all their steps, to maybe cut out the long tails of the distribution, to explain why they cut out the long tails, right? To show the primary effect, which has to have a certain statistical significance to be robust and believed, blah, 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 right? Artists don't have to do that. So it's a very different discipline with different institutions. And for my part, it can produce doubt, which is a cousin of curiosity. So rather than, oh, scientists say this about the ice sheet, I love that comment of Kate's. It's like, what do scientists say about our ice sheets? And what do spiders say about ice sheets? And is there algae showing up under the ice sheet that has been able to get photosynthesis to happen because the ice sheet is thin? And what's that doing to the climate? Because there's oxygen coming out of the algae, right? In other words, artists can sort of put lots of sciences together and ask very vague questions that just get people thinking and talking. So there are sciences like that. And I'm sure Kate is deep in collaboration with scientists who are themselves interdisciplinary, right? But I do think there are important distinctions, certainly in how these domains are published, how they're rewarded, how people are promoted in the academy for doing these things, and so on. So I do think there are very important distinctions and reasons why we continue to keep them separate, because they do different things culturally.
Is there benefit to bringing them together and not keeping them separate?
Well, they are together in Tomás's work, and obviously it's exhilarating. So I'm not keeping them separate. I'm just pointing out that it's extremely unusual for an artist to be a collaborative author on a scientific paper.
Mm.
And it's also, let me just say to the art world out there, the authorship structures of the art world do not give the scientist collaborators authorial credit. They do not get a percentage of the work when it's sold in the gallery system.
I guess I asked that what are the benefits are because I'm beginning to see, I think, in the nature of the climate crisis, a sort of need to bring these types of teams together and a need to break down some of those traditional boundaries and traditional professional ways of knowing, like Kate said, simply because the problem or the challenge itself is so complex and so intersectional and so far-reaching that it almost demands that, you know, scientists and artists and ski guides and whoever else kind of get together and ask those questions and get curious about it in the way that you just said, Caroline. And so I wonder if the moment that we're in is in fact what is leading to this type of work or making this type of work all the more necessary. I wonder, yes, and credit the spiders. I love that. Thank you. Ski guides, spiders.
I have a thought actually about thinking about the interdisciplinarity, because within university research of all kinds, there is a need for technical work to take place. And it is appropriate that it be hyper-technical and that knowledge in its tighter forms is advanced. But most thinkers in the university I know who are advancing knowledge are not doing it with their blinders on. That thinking involves a kind of larger sense of knowledge, which basically means interdisciplinary consciousness. And it seems to me that the part of what we're talking about is the need to put a more precise and more technical discussion out in public, and not just, you know, in the professional journals and the labs. And the work in public we could call work in progress. And because the idea is to make some change, right, and save our planet. But that work in progress is going to be something we do concretely, step by step, in the ways that we can, you know, coming together on occasions, doing projects of different kinds, but there's no recipe for it exactly. And it also involves, you know, in terms of the public discussion, people realizing that we all have to be comfortable listening and trying to understand the thing we don't know yet. And our mass culture, especially in the States, doesn't really let us live in this zone where you are confronted with the thing you don't know yet, and it's a truth. You know, fantasy is one thing, but a truth. And so I find the Shed Show very interesting for lots of reasons, because it's a hybrid animal. And, you know, whether it can house more technical discussions, Kate, I don't know if an art exhibition can really do that and produce the scene, let's say, for that kind of exchange.
I think it's a fascinating question to think about. You know, something that's preoccupied me for a long time is when you suggest to scientists, you know, and I want to point out that Carolyn is absolutely right, that the academy, the tenure structure, you know, the incentive structure does not support this kind of thing. But most scientists, especially most young scientists, most scientists who are interested in engaging with these ideas, get really excited when you mention art crossovers. Scientists, you know, a lot of young scientists especially have hobbies. They write or they create art, or they do, they have some form of engagement with the world of creativity as defined by the arts. And yet, if you were to go into a typical art school, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, and say, you should take math all 4 years of art school. You should know advanced math. You should know how to design an algorithm. You should know how to code. You should know how to solve equations. My guess is that people would be aghast at that. And what I'm wondering is how we who use math as a tool, we who use math to build models of the world, can break down those barriers and offer it up as a tool that is not frightening, that is useful, and that might be useful to create with.
Yeah, big question. I think we might be getting into a question there about elementary school education and some things in this country about how we position these different types of work, how from a very early age we tend to segment it until you're forced to pick a bucket, even though, as Kate says, almost everybody I know, and as Molly says, everybody has these different sides of their work, of their person, and in some ways we've been encouraged to bring our official self or our official role to the table, but there's a full person there. So there's two threads here I wanted to pick up on. I want to come back to that uncertainty, as Caroline said, because it came up again, but maybe we'll return to that. But I just wanted to pick up here with this question of roles and the sort of official story we tell, because I also think there's sometimes a boundary, perhaps an artificial boundary between the personal and the professional. And I think your upcoming book opens up some of these questions of the emotional story of climate change. And I wonder if that could be brought into this too, of what are you doing there and how does that fit into these question of roles and boundaries?
I want to point out that I am not an expert in emotions, other than having them. I know no psychology, no psychiatry. I've engaged not a bit with the cognitive science literature. But something that really bothered me is I would get angry about things. Some politician would say something very outrageously silly, and I would feel angry about it. Or somebody would weaponize something that a scientist said about climate, and I would be really upset about it. And I remember thinking, I don't want to pretend that I don't have emotions. I don't think it makes me a more objective scientist to lie about having feelings, because saying I don't feel sad, I don't feel angry, I don't feel scared, I don't feel happy sometimes, that just strikes me as lying. And I don't think that makes you more honest, is, by pretending that you don't feel things. And that seems to me to be a good way to reach out to other people, because we all have feelings. Not all of us have seen all of the art exhibits in the world. Not all of us are familiar with, the specifics of art historical theory. I know I'm certainly not. I'm learning a lot. Not all of us are familiar with, the tools of math or physics or computer science, but all of us feel things. And I think as scientists, acknowledging that we too feel things is really useful for starting to make connections and starting to be able to listen as opposed to just talk about our results.
I'd like to interject that feeling is fabulous and politics are dangerous. So I think Kate probably knows very well some of the early climate scientists who were working very hard to sound the clarion call back when the EPA was founded and Earth Day happened, and so you can say, wait, that was 1970. What happened? One of the things that happened is that scientists who chose to speak out, were then considered not neutral and had more difficulty getting grants and getting, legitimacy as scientists. So it's a very difficult world where, as Kate mentioned, science is weaponized. Art remains, for the most part, kind of a safe space for having these conversations, partly because the climate deniers don't yet know that the conversations are going on in the art world. But I do treasure the recent writing by Rebecca Solnit, a cultural commentator, who says that denialism of climate urgencies is very close to despair around climate urgencies, and they are both false certainties. And I think that's a very beautiful piece of teaching for us. And what I love about both art and science is that they keep the space open. They refuse to close it down, right? And that's one of the great things, like Newton gets to be wrong at a certain point because science keeps those questions open. So I just wanted to put in that subject about politics, which is so fraught. And maybe that's a little love letter to Molly, and she can talk about Utopia Station, which was, you know, an attempt in the art world to say, yeah, politics is everywhere. What if we collectively try to imagine a better place, which is what Utopia stands for, just simply a better place, a good place. Anyway, just a random meditation there, but I know that scientists are still scared to put their feelings into politics because science itself, you know, they can have their emails subpoenaed, for God's sake. It's a terrifying world.
Look, I will weigh in now. It all goes back to the Cold War, and you know, the idea that politics
is being reinvented right now, right? We get to have a new Cold War.
It's, but the I think part of the question that comes up with the need to use emotions, but emotions are somehow taboo, has something to do with the taboo on subjectivity in all kinds of scientific writing. But I also think emotion is, it's also using the full register of your voice. And so I don't know that emotion needs to be segregated so much as, you know, gathered into the questions of tone and the passion that you bring, or whether you speak high or whether you speak low. You know, I mean, the writers explore their voices. We are all writers. We have the right to a voice. And the use of a voice in public, I don't know how you get around the politics stuff, because politics and the imbalances of power and the visions of our social life are simply inscribed in so much that to, you know, try to extract it and look at it as a factor or a lump is to talk about it in a kind of mechanical way, maybe. And politics aren't mechanical, generally. But the other thing I'm kind of fascinated by, because I'm currently teaching a course that goes from 1968 to now, and there's this thing called theory in the middle of it that is kind of everywhere. And theory, as was said back in the day very wisely by the great Fred Jameson, theory is philosophy. And what interests me about our conversation is that philosophy per se is not in it, you know? And I'm sort of surprised. I mean, when I went to graduate school, everybody read philosophy. It was food, and of different kinds. And, you know, it was a tool for the toolkit. It helped you sort your problems down and make some intellectual sense of them. But I'm wondering where I still hold philosophy dear, but I'm wondering why it's absent and not on the table per se.
Well, a lot of good questions being put on the table. I want to flag one or two things as we speak about philosophy and theory. I also want to sort of throw into the mix there this question of one of the things that I saw in this exhibit is building worlds. I'm very attuned to this because as a theatrical set designer, I've made little model worlds, made big worlds on stage. I've heard Kate, you speak about creating worlds. For me, they're very physical little worlds with little set models, and for you, I don't know how they take form. In the exhibit, they obviously took sort of almost building universes out of these webs. So it's a kind of meeting of that philosophy or theory, and yet a very tangible model of the universe or of the world. And I'm wondering, it's a big one, but we're close to the end. Audience, please put any questions in the chat if you want to get your question in, or in the Q&A. I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about this question of creating and imagining worlds, which we see in Saraceno's work and which artists do, scientists do. How is this, and I think, Molly, this may lead to Caroline's question about Utopia Station. How is this process of imagining worlds a tool or a potential pathway for a climate response? How does it fit into imagining a thriving future? The big one.
Well, I'll just start it off, but I'm going to pass it to Kate, because I think really to step into that question and say something about it means thinking smaller, and maybe thinking in terms of microclimates, maybe, in order to make the kinds of adjustments that would make things settle into a more livable place.
Really? Because I think that what the exhibit opens up is the possibility of thinking so big, of imagining and modeling, actually being able to model a world or a universe that is at the vastest scale possible, and also at the teeniest. I saw in this exhibit all of the scales in between.
Well, let me throw out that Tomás also has his own name for our epoch, right? Which is a minor sport in the humanities. Oh, do you want to take the stratigraphy name of the Anthropocene, or do you want to make up the Plantationocene or the Capitalocene or the Clucocene? So Tomás has his name, the Aerocene, and he's committed to suborbit, geosynchronous or maybe orbital flight without fossil fuel, which is pretty amazing. And part of that work is chained to the monitoring of local climates that empower communities in, say, Sao Paulo to track pollution, to Molly's point about microclimate interventions. So again, I love the artistic imagination there. Like we shouldn't be burning fossil fuel to go up and see if there's fossil fuel creating greenhouse gas residues in the atmosphere that are making our planet heat up, right? We should be finding an original way without using up the planetary helium, which is another, rare gas, right? So he's made these beautiful black silk bags that simply heat up with solar energy, float up, and then as the earth cools, they kind of ride these waves of the thermal cooling and heating of the planet. So you have to give up precision, you have to give up control, you have to give up exact parameters of what you're measuring. But I find it a very beautiful metaphor for citizen science, which is something that I think artists feel very connected to, right? And they want to empower it, and they want to collaborate with it where they can locally. So that's just a kind of a feature. So, he has these structures that he makes out of community projects that glue together trash bags, plastic bags. Find a use for them that will become these big solar heated bladders that will float up and observe things for us, right? So I find that kind of crazy repurposing ingenuity pretty inspiring. It can't be published as science, but it can empower those communities to begin to realize they have the tools to collect some of the information about their very own climate, their very own environment.
Yeah, I so much to think about here. Just trying to weave together some of the things that I've heard that are really inspiring to me. I also love Rebecca Solnit's essay about, the false confidence of despair and the attempt to evade uncertainty by just falling into, everything's doomed, assuming the worst case scenario. And I find that a lot in some artistic responses to climate change. I think we're living through a time where a lot of people have gone from completely ignoring the climate crisis to to proclaiming we're all doomed without kind of stopping at doing literally anything to help in the middle. And that annoys me a little bit. And what I love about the concept of the Aerocene is that it is, to use a scientific word, amazingly cool. And thinking about the future not as dystopia and not as utopia, but as just kind of topia, where there are terrible things happening. There's ecological destruction. Even if we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will still lose so much. But at the same time, why can't that future world be populated with wonder and ingenuity and fun and whimsy? Why can't both of those things coexist with each other? And that is something that I just deeply appreciate about this kind of work. Not only the really rigorous engagement with science, but also the attempting to think about a future where fun is allowed, where it's not just punishment and it's not just despair and it's not just doom. So that's something that I really appreciate about this.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think the work invites it partly because of that question of uncertainty and destabilizing, is when you're looking or experiencing this work and you say, well, it's confronting me with big questions, but it's also beautiful and it's also fun and I'm also curious. So you can have this complex experience of the event and therefore move away from those false certainties, those the despair and denial trap web. So we are at 6:59. So I think we should pause here because that's a beautiful spot. I think we really came full circle in terms of those questions of scale, uncertainty, and how they connect to this very, very real moment in human history and the moments that are coming, which of course are going to be all of the above, as Kate implies. There's going to be some despair and there's going to be a lot of beauty, and just the way there is today. So thank you all so much. Tomás, thank you for joining the chat, and thank you for throwing us in. I want to also, as Tomás suggested, give a shout out to the spiders who contributed a huge amount to the exhibit and the work. It's absolutely stunning. I remember I said, wait, these are real spider webs. How do they transport them? I couldn't get over it. But thank you to the Climate School and the Shed for inviting us here. Thank you to all these audience members for joining the conversation, and especially to Kate, Caroline, and Molly for your perspectives. It's really an honor to be with three such amazing thinkers who can go everywhere that you went tonight. So thank you. So we are going to sign off, turn off our cameras, panelists, unless Kate or Caroline or Molly, you have any parting words for our audience.
Just keep caring.
And Lavender, thank you.